Hello. One of the great sadnesses for most Christians is the fact of Christian disunity. And one of the greatest divisions in Christianity is between the Christians of the Greek East and those of the Latin West. And most Christians in English-speaking countries are subsections of Latin Christianity. One of the attempts in the late Middle Ages to try and heal that was the Council of Florence. And with me to discuss the Council of Florence is Dr. Mary Cunningham. Mary, you're very welcome.
Thank you.
Mary, the Council of Florence is it hasn't got the fame of the Council of Chalcedon or Nicaea. It hasn't got the sort of recent cachet of Vatican II. Tell us when the Council of Florence was and something about it.
The Council of Florence took place in 1438 and 39. It actually began in Ferrara and then it was moved to Florence in Italy. And perhaps one of the reasons it's not remembered so much is because it actually failed in the end. Union was signed between the Greeks and the Latins, or I should say all the Orthodox churches, there were Russians there too, and the Latin West, but the will wasn't there to keep that union going. There were political reasons for seeking union. The Byzantine Empire was on the brink of being invaded by the Turks, and Constantinople, of course, fell in 1453 when this final invasion took place. And they had gone to the West in 1438 really to seek aid and hoping for another crusade to come and deliver them from the Turks. And they hoped that by achieving union between the two churches, a union that had not been there since 1054 when the Great Schism had occurred officially, they hoped that the Latins would come and help them out. So a number of issues were discussed between the two churches, the main ones being the subject of purgatory and the other one being a small addition in the creed. This is the statement that Christians make, the statement of belief, and it's just the addition of one word, filioque, to the clause that deals with the Holy Spirit, which in the West had been added since about the 6th century, and since about the 9th had papal approval for it being in the creed, and the Greeks had never approved that addition to the creed. So those were the two main issues that were discussed and eventually agreed at that council.
Just before we move on to those two issues, it's one of the sad things, of course, is that it's very easy for theologians to come to agreement, but it's a very different thing for people to have the will and the cultural will to actually come together. The Council of Florence strikes me as being the sort of thing that theologians could agree, but actually the cultural differences, even in the face of an external threat, could actually keep these two groups apart.
That's right, and I think what you see happening in the discussions that took place is a great cultural divide, that they had difficulty understanding each other. The Latins used syllogistic reasoning, advanced systematic theological arguments to defend their position, and the Greeks were completely mystified by this. They argued from their tradition, from the fact that the early fathers had supported particular positions on doctrine, and they couldn't understand this kind of reasoning that was going on, which had been going on in the West since the period of scholasticism.
And of course, even though the official break was in 1054, for 500 years before that, Christians in the West were no longer reading Greek books, and increasingly Christians in the East were no longer reading Latin books. So you have people they're only talking to themselves, they're not talking to each other. And if you do that for 500 years, it's not surprising then you come up with a suddenly, you then find, as it were, the psychological moment.
That's true.
Okay, let's look at these two issues, because it's interesting that they were even at a theological level able to find some sort of agreement. Let's start with the purgatory question.
Mm-hmm. Well, in the West, ideas about purgatory had developed really quite late in the 11th and 12th centuries. But during the period of scholasticism, they had tried to define very precisely what actually happens after a person dies. Where does their soul go? And they had arrived at very complex and quite detailed ideas about how a soul is tested in purgatory, purified of its sins, how this is a period of sort of preparation for the final judgment. And if you read a text like Dante's Inferno, you can see how detailed this picture could be. The Greeks had never developed such a systematic idea about what happens after death, and they were really perplexed and rather shocked by this position which the West wanted them to accept. They felt what happens after our death is a mystery. It's not revealed to us by God. There are sort of two aspects to the question as well. One is the question of what happens to the soul. The general Christian belief, of course, being that the soul is separated from the body, but the two will come together again at the time of the last resurrection. But in between, the soul is going through these ordeals or whatever after death. So there's the question of what happens to the soul after death. And the second question that's related to it is, do the prayers of living people on behalf of those who have died do them any good? Can we help people achieve a better answer at the Last Judgment by praying for them? And the Greeks on both of those issues wanted to retain a sense of mystery. We can attempt to pray for people, and they certainly did believe in intercession for the dead, but they couldn't understand how in the West there could be such detailed and precise ideas of exactly how many prayers might buy you so many fewer years in purgatory, and this kind of issue that people had not been afraid to address in the West.
And of course, the whole question of purgatory would explode for the West 70 or 80 years after the Council of Florence, when it would become one of the explosive division points in the Western Reformation. And indeed, it's still one of the things that causes division within Western churches.
This is true.
That tiny little word, filioque, and the Son. The original creed said, who proceeds from the Father. The Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father, and they think, and then in Latin is qui ex patre filioque procedit, who proceeds from the Father and the Son, filioque. And to Westerners, it seems, well, since all three are one, it's, what's the problem?
Well, the main problem for the Greeks was simply that it was not there in the creed as it had been originally defined. That was at the Council of Constantinople in 381 and ratified at Chalcedon in 451. So they saw no reason why you should add this small word to the creed. But there are theological issues too. I think the Greeks felt, and the Orthodox Church still would feel, that this suggests a hierarchy among the three persons and makes the Holy Spirit a less important person than the Father and the Son. The clause was originally added in the West probably to combat Arianism in Visigothic Spain. this desire to show that the Son, Christ, is divine and is of one substance with the Father would be reinforced by saying that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. But I think that the Greeks felt that this creates some kind of hierarchical descent so that the Holy Spirit comes after the Son, as it were, rather than holding the three together in equality and in one substance or essence.
And of course there's been an interesting development in the last 20 years in the West, in that in many ecumenical situations, filioque is just omitted.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, the West has realized it did its job. It may have served a purpose in Spain in the first millennium. In the second millennium, it just caused division, and maybe the time has come just to quietly move beyond it. Looking back, and I look back as a Westerner, I'm a Latin theologian. At one level, I'm always sad about the Council of Florence, but at another level, it says, gosh, if we got even that far again, it shows that the very fact that they got as far as they did shows what can be done. Is it fair to? I think we would both think, gosh, it was a failure. But is it fair to look back and say, well, at least it shows what can happen?
I think it is very true that it's something that should not be forgotten. That discussions did take place, and that agreements were reached. The will wasn't there at the time, but it is something that can be built on. Just one other point I could make at this as we close is that I heard a recent talk by Metropolitan Callistos in which he was talking about the Council of Florence and saying they spent 10 months discussing the filioque and 10 days on the issue of papal primacy. Today, probably the much more important issue for the Orthodox churches, as they are, in fact, thinking again about union with the Catholic West, is the issue of papal primacy, that is, the Pope being the first among the 5 patriarchs and the extent of his supreme authority. That's a much bigger issue for Christians today, I think, to overcome, whereas the filioque has receded in importance for theologians and for bishops and for probably ordinary lay people in both churches. So the issues shift slightly, but the will is certainly there today, I would say, and the Council of Florence can be seen as a first attempt which laid a lot of important foundations for what may take place.
Mary, on that very optimistic note, thank you.
Thank you.